What if the cycle you live inside has happened before? You stand in a room of dust and waiting. I will walk with you. I will keep time with the pause between records. Where are you now? And what hour do you give to this silence? Remain still. Attend the brittle things laid before you. Hear the strata. Subscribe to the ritual of return if you must. Follow the slow unfolding as if it were a document you have been asked to preserve. I am not a voice of answers. We will move slowly. We will tend to what is left. To walk among the altars of vanished kings is to inherit a story already told. It is a contour of memory, echoed unbroken from one regnal stone to the next, a sequence asserted by the persistence of clay and script. The accepted belief is seamless. The line of kings continues, undisturbed. Authority is imagined as cumulative, legitimacy as thread never torn, never spliced. The lists, it is said, chart the ruling order as inevitable, almost natural. In the story, as it was once told by handlers of archives, there are no gaps. There is only what is written. You touch the surface of that ideal. It does not hold. The clay is a wavering witness. One tablet, pale against the dust, presents a run of names, clear, ordered, a narrow column speaking in the stilled syllables of cuneiform. In another room, another tablet, nearly its twin in shape, tilts away from the first. The names do not match. Where there are 20 in one, there are 16 in the other. A sequence is disturbed. The numbers do not resolve. A closer gaze traces stubby marks. An erasure. Certain names pressed into clay, later worked away with a wet finger or a tool, replaced by fresh script, the old surface left uneven, the edges unsettled. Here is the palimpsest, scored in the clay's own shallow memory lines, scraped thin, then rewritten. Column 2 is marred to the touch abrasion, measurable beneath a careful finger, as if a patient hand, centuries ago, persisted in scraping at stubborn text that refused to leave entirely. The contour of old inscription still haunts the new. A forensic calm settles in. With each surface, you chart the interruptions. Mortar residue clings to the broken rise along the tablet's back, a faint crust where some later decade sought to fix it, mounting fragment to stone, binding piece to wall or shelf, asserting preservation against loss. The choices of storage echo as much as those of erasure. What is not shown continues to shape the record. The archives are more than their tablets. In the same strata, ledgers appear administrative lists, receipts, obligations, bearers of duties that rise, halt, and resume as if responding to some invisible interval. There are seasons where counting ceases. The records halt, blank space, then numbers begin again, tentative, resuming. The ledgers stop and restart, as if time itself staggered briefly, only to correct course. What prompted the pause, what was lost between ledger and list, is neither named nor explained. Only the material gap remains. Paper becomes silence as clay becomes void. Authority, once thought continuous, flickers in the archive's hands. Around these records, the ground itself intervenes. Charred layers underfoot attest to occupation lenses of carbonized matter, sampled, gridded, tested by the slow mathematics of radiocarbon decay. The layers bracket an interval, capturing moments of presence and absence. Each sample estimates the before and after, but fails to pinpoint the breadth of regnal time. There is no perfect fit between king and carbon. The evidence brackets but does not quite meet. Measurement outlines the outline of a reign, but the line itself cannot be drawn with any precision. You are left between intervals never quite atop the moment where name, dwelling, and time converge into one legible truth. The rulers exist in the air between numbers. When the tablets are finally lowered into darkness, when the archive is sealed or abandoned, the cuneiform columns sleep, their authority at rest, their gaps concealed by the dust of centuries. No scribe wakes to fill in the margins. No witness returns to restore what has been cleaved away. The ideal of continuity lingers only in the spaces where succession is imagined, an unbroken line conjured precisely where the record falls silent. The legitimate line is, after all, a construction of what is preserved, but what survives is shaped as much by omission as by inscription. Were the excised names erased in purpose, or for reasons that remain out of reach? Did a lapse in record-keeping represent a void in power, or simply a lapse in memory? The evidence suggests less than it claims, circling a question it cannot answer. You find yourself returned repeatedly to the surface palimpsested, abraded, reinscribed. Each examination yields loss as much as knowledge. The silence is not mere absence, but a kind of presence, a tension held between what the clay shows and what it withholds. This is the line that breaks, not by violence, but by interruption. The tablets coexist, but do not agree. Ledgers pause, resumes uncertain. Occupation layers burn and darken, but daylight does not clarify sequence. The authority once read in a column of names frays at its edges. The continuity assumed is unsettled by the seams within stone and soil. What the archive preserves above all is the impossibility of a whole account. The names omitted are not erased from history, but from our capacity to name them. Which names were left out? There is a steadiness to what is expected, a familiar consolation in the narrative that destruction happens quickly, in a single ravaging moment. The assumption persists that these cities were swept away in an abrupt, cataclysmic flood, an event so total that the ordinary cadence of life was silenced in one final collapse. Urban existence, measured and mundane, transformed in an instant into sedimented memory. Walls dissolved, streets erased, a singular final breath caught up in water and detained under mud. Yet, below the surface, evidence unspools with a patience that undercuts such certainty. The story, as written in the layers themselves, resists swift absolution. Stratigraphic sequences peel away the surface. Each city mound, sheared and drawn, shows not a single massive deposit, but the repetition of silty laminations, thin and insistent. These laminae do not announce themselves. They accumulate. 1 centimetre, then another. A measured section, methodically noted in the field book, pale brown against grey, the memory of a river's quiet overreach, preserved in stratified hush. In the register of the archive, the sequence translates into ordered numbers and crosshatch drawings. Granulometry reveals the silt grain by grain, arranging statistics where once there was chaos. Each fraction passes through the wire mesh, recorded, weighted, and indexed in reports that collect in cabinets. The sediment, sliced from the mound, is parcelled into bags. An observer's glove, reddened by clay, fingertips dusted. Each sample tells the same partial account. Nothing loud, nothing grand. Looking closer, between the thin silt bands, there is evidence of life persisting between episodes. Pottery sherds broken but identifiably local, their edges dulled by centuries' rest in the silts. Charcoal fragments, inert but carbon-rich, signal the ghost of hearths. Fires kindled, extinguished, stoked again. Traces of compacted floors remain, flat and resistant, palpable between the layers. These markers echo occupation. They suggest not an erasure, but a slow negotiation. Silt falls, people stay. Silt returns, people sweep, build, endure. The evidence is stubborn in its mundanity. Microfaunal assemblages are preserved, minute skeletons nestled gently into the space between silty increments. Not washed away wholesale, not mangled. A continuity persists, subtle but undeniable, through the recurring rhythm of deposition. In shallow sondages, aligned with uncertain precision across kilometres, the pattern repeats. Each shallow cut exposes the quiet signature, a centimetre here, 2 there, suggesting episodic overbank events. Not a wall of water, but the pulse of seasons and decades. Not the aftermath of a single night, but the murmur of return. Surges, recessions, silt that waits, silt that spreads. Samples, scraped and extracted, are labelled in ink that is already beginning to fade. The archive envelopes thicken, each drawing folded inside, with the expectation of meaning deferred. Time weighs on the edges of these sections, the slow collapse of glue, of paper, of memory itself. A cross-section rendered in graphite on vellum is smoothed by the archivist's hand, pressed into an envelope. No page is final, no lamination exhausts the story. There is always the space between, the interval unnamed. The evidence resists the sweep of certainty. Every measured section exposes the tension between the comfort of an instantaneous end and the unease of protracted change. One vision is sharp, conclusive, brutally efficient. The other is sedimentary endurance, built on the repetition of uncertainty. The silt that accumulates is never singular, never definitive. It comes, rests, is noticed, is swept aside, is replaced. The act of recording becomes habitual, entering the realm of ceremony, measured, described, returned to the envelope. The assumption of disaster, the finality of instant collapse, echoes in the desire to resolve. Yet, the evidence holds its own counsel. Pottery in one lamina and again in the next. Charcoal in each, sometimes denser, sometimes sparse. Flaws recur, pressed into existence by generations unknown. The layers register human time not as a line, but as a series of hesitations and returns. Each event, small or large, leaves its trace, bounded by silt. Within their thinness is the space of waiting a question about endurance, about pause, about return. The sediment itself does not hurry. There is always more dust, more accumulation, the next envelope in the archive, the next decade sketched in millimeters, lives framed by the brief absence between deposits. By the presumption of time itself stretching thin, nothing is resolved. There is only the gentle repetition of laying down and lifting up. The section drawing rests inside the envelope, uncertain of what it reveals, indifferent to what it omits. How long did each thin layer keep them waiting? Assumptions settle quietly over distant archives, patient as dust. The belief holds that ration tablets silent in their rectilinear stacks guarantee steady provisioning, evidence of demographic stability written in careful hands. It is a story that unfolds without noise, where administrative order is presumed seamless. Each tablet, a silent testament to the constancy of distribution, every household receiving its share, and the surplus carefully portioned. In this imagining, the system works. The illusion of equilibrium becomes its own reassurance, layered over decades, centuries, with an untroubled surface. Yet the ground shifts beneath such certainties. What endures in the records, and what slips past the scribe's stylus? A closer reading unsettles the calm pattern. Housed within boxes, trays, and memory, the succession of ration lists speaks with a different voice. There are tablets, drawn from household archives, that no longer align with expectation. Each bears not the promise of constancy, but the evidence of abrupt declines, quantities suddenly lesser, recipient names exchanged almost without warning. Now, in the half-light of preservation, you observe these changes recorded in the clay, or the world beneath it rearranged itself overnight. The documentary record sits still beneath glass, yet it is never silent. Columns are inscribed with care, enumerating commodity types. Barley, oil, wool, each rendered in measured volumetric units, strokes incised and tallied, marks repeated by hands, both practiced and new. There are tally signs, some sharp, others softened by touch and time, but all caught in the small discipline of repetition. Workshop seals pressed, rolled, at times little more than a blur shift location and emblem, their impressions mapping a bureaucratic geography now half erased. The tablets themselves bear the patient coordinates of archaeological method. Excavation squares, calibrated dates pulled from associated detritus, context layered upon context. A few tablets end mid-line, as if the script and the scribe were both called elsewhere, or as if the arithmetic of consumption proved unsustainable before its reckoning concluded. Others are found folded, compressed, then carefully cached in hollows beneath later floors. Each decision whether to finish, to fold, or to conceal remains invisible to us, the evidence hollowed out by what it cannot say. Here, a strange continuity asserts itself. The format repeats, almost unvaried. Columns and units, lists and names, signatures and seals, but the content, always shifting names erased or replaced, numbers slashed or quietly reduced, bears in itself attention. Form promises procedure, the illusion of order. Within, however, the writing itself becomes less sure, gaps opening between the expected and the real. There is a rhythm to this discontinuity, a haunted regularity where scarcity creeps in under a cloak of administrative sameness. You look and look again, searching for an anchor, the silence of their preservation emphasizing what once passed from hand to hand. They are no longer ration. They are memory, calcified in their quietude, carrying both what was measured and what fell outside the system's gaze. Excavation not only retrieves these witnesses from the earth, but brings their absences into sharper relief. Categories appear full and repeated, but the very fact of a sudden reduction, a name spliced out, a line left incomplete, unsettles. In the commingling of record and erasure, what is said is always shadowed by what is not said. The calibrations suggest an effort to map and to count, yet those efforts are betrayed by the interrupted lists and the shift in seals. The traces of hands, sometimes the same, often different, carry out their inscription, sometimes in haste, sometimes with the slow deliberation of one who knows what is at stake. But the archive, even at its most rigorous, cannot transcribe every contingency. Scarcity and replacement linger in what is omitted. Change is unremarked except by the abruptness of their imprint. The present moment allows you no fuller access than did the past to those who inscribed the clay. The archives are quiet, the trays cold and protective, the glass a boundary you cannot cross. Each tablet communicates in the logic of enumeration, yet whispers of all it fails to count echo in the hush. You are left with the juxtaposition, form promising abundance, content shadowed by want. The evidence is held in suspension, between counting and inability, between presence and absence. You remain with the silence, the memory of hands, the unsteady script, the void between. The story rests quietly on an assumption. Cylinder seals, functionally precise, designed to move between hands, across thresholds, within a stable grid of administration. Their purpose appears self-evident. Each seal marks identity. Each rolling incisors continuity, pressed signatures of order. And so, the archive asserts, the seal is its owner, is its impression, is its legitimacy. Stones, engraved and taken up in the fingers, believed to say, without hesitation, this is stable, this is certain, this is the same. Yet, when the drawers open and silence thickens, something older and less resolved settles into the light. The expectation of reliability loosens under evidence. In the temple stores, a set of seals offers a more complicated reading. Recarved motifs interrupt the smooth surface of what was thought to be continuous. Iconographic programs, overlapping and inconsistent, populate the record. Each seal, a small cylindrical stone, catalogued by unseen hands. Length and diameter measured, notated in careful columns, dimensions in millimeters, incision depths rendered into micrometers. Raking light cast across uneven grooves. The stone does not yield its story easily, but the tool marks persist, hems and ridges at the very threshold of visibility. Impressions rolled onto clay tags. The impression is a layer, a sediment of past cut over present cut, of old motif glimpsed beneath the new design. Some impressions, fragile, reveal the ghost of what came before. An earlier animal head, overtaken by a later cuneiform character. Spirals clipped, a figure's arm bent where once it reached out unbroken. Select a seal from the register, turn it slowly in gloved hands, mark its scar and patina. Photograph the facets where the motif thins or deepens. New records accumulate, parallel to the old, but never quite aligning. Inventory proceeds. Everything named, measured, numbered, nothing fully resolved. Silence gathers in the absences, the moments the record cannot fill. Clay tags bear impressions from seals whose surfaces are altered and overwritten. The layered clay, dried by centuries, stores a palimpsest, a history unspoken, muted but insistent in its texture. Some tags originate in one deposit, some in another, separated by decades or even centuries. The same seal appears, its identity called into question by the persistence of form, but instability of content. Whose approval endures, whose hand lingers in the press of stone to clay, when seal and sign do not coincide. Under raking light, a fissure appears, running parallel to the length of the seal. Photomicrographs reveal the difference. Time etched into stone, newness overlaid upon what was meant to be permanent. The catalogue numbers, fixed and final, are silent on the matter of meaning. The evidence sits, quiet, layered upon itself. No voice insists on explanation. The seals, inventory within drawers lined by archival paper, offer only what is visible. Each measurement acknowledges its limits. Calipers pressed gently against stone, digital gauges blinking out numbers, the human hand hesitant before the smooth, indifferent surface. There is no record for whose hands pressed these tools, no annotation for how or why one motif subsumed another. Continuity fractures, mostly without sound. Administrative practice, intended to anchor identity with seal, buckles under its own material history. The cylinder, once fresh cut, named and assigned, becomes another kind of record not singular, but palimpsestic, neither wholly new nor wholly preserved. The very reliability that gave it value in the mornings of its making is unsettled by the evenings found in the stores. When the stone is handled, no answer emerges, only the continuous inventorying of uncertainty. Later, the impressions themselves are brushed free of dust, placed side by side, the same seal rolled across differing clays. One dates from a storeroom floor swept 200 years after the other, motifs out of order. Whose authority remains the one who cut the stone, or the one who pressed it last? The question recurs, unresolved. The seals lie quiet in drawers, outlasted by their own ambiguity. Cabinets close, lights dim. The material suggests a tension, a patient, visceral argument between the aspiration to continuity and the insistence of reuse. Layer over layer, incision over incision, presence effaced by the passage of a finer tool or a different hand. The archive rests. Whose impressions were pressed into later clay? The story of ceramics is most often recited as a procession of predictable transitions, a confidence in lineages charted by hands and hearth. Each phase, it is believed, curls out of the last, like smoke, one discrete form folding quietly into another, propelled by the gentle logic of social and technological change. Shards nest within their typologies, and sequences tie themselves together across centuries. Each interval accounted for by a continuity no one dares to doubt outright. Kilns fire, vessels form, traditions persist. The record, it is said, advances by steady increments. The pulse of clay and heat measured always by human constancy. That has always been the way the evidence is first received, as a story that completes itself. And yet, there is an interruption, abrupt, recorded not in lost words or vanished witnesses, but in the afterglow of matter itself. The layers underfoot resist gentle sequencing. Thermoluminescence, indifferent to typology or tradition, unfurls its results, a reduction, sudden and wide. In the count of firing events, the pattern repeats, site after site, echoed in the odd quiet of strata, where the language of tradition pretends continuity, yet the proof of heat withdraws its signal. The familiar pulse falters, chronology fragments, the expectation of progression is caught, suspended in an unforeseen hush. The laboratories accept the evidence with the neutrality of their purpose. Kiln floor samples are logged on a sheet location. Depth, context, no voice raised, just the circumspect witnessing of soil and clay. Each fragment handled with methodical hands, each protocol observed. Into the shielded trays, the powdered samples are poured, cooled beads of earth measured for their after images of light. The glow curve graphs emerge, their slow climbs and sudden plateaus rendered as silent signals, each adrift in the memory of heat. Replicate dating runs spread across the lab records, each error margin a measured consent to uncertainty. The numbers gather, fewer events, contracted intervals, a compression of burning that resists all attempts at seamless narrative. A collapse layer settles across the sequence, neither loud nor dramatic, but unconcealed for those who watch. Above it, a different stillness. Few sherds show the sharp flame signatures that mark earlier assemblages. The recorders make note, write carefully in the logs, no alteration in the observation, just the undeniable annotation of difference. Pottery forms maintain their shape, the outer curves preserved in the typologies that anchor every chart. But the sense of abundance, once apparent in every layer, is muted. The rate of production, tallied in traces of firing, dissolves to near silence. Hands may have shaped clay, but fires have cooled. The continuity promised by form no longer aligns with the rhythm marked by fuel and flame. In the trays by the window, sherds rest in lines, cooling beyond any capacity to be reheated. Even their microscopic lattices, probed for the residues of ancient burning, now betray absence more than presence. There is no drama here, only the persistence of matter and the diminishment of action witnessed by light. Protocol logs thicken, each entry reinforcing another interval where activity will not be found. Glow curve graphs stack, page on page, the evidence inscribing an absence more systematically than any abundance. To witness this, to let the data accumulate in the mind, is to see the gap widen. Hands, patterns, and purpose flicker in the shallow lens of speculation. Fired clay persists as the evidence of potential continuity, while the story of fire itself dwindles. A chapter in the archaeological register, written not by what was left behind, but by what ceases to appear. The index of events becomes a silence. No explanation presumes to fill it. Measurement, always careful, now finds more in the gaps than in the line. Before and after arrange themselves as a threshold beneath, warmth and frequency. Above, the after-image of manufacture clinging to form, unrenewed. The hands that kept the fires, whether many or few, retreat into statistical ranges and measured intervals, the logic of their absence remaining. Continuity in appearance, fracture in production. The system of typologies bends but does not break. It simply loses its cadence. You, standing silent before shelves of sherds and pages of protocol, sense the pulse of what is missing. Evidence gathers in its own quiet revolution, layering the memory of matter against the assurance of sequence, drawing attention to all that is absent, to everything that cannot be easily told. Firing events diminish, forms persist, the traces of heat narrow to a hush that settles in the present as well as the past. The sherds, never to be refired or reshaped, now simply cool in their trays unresolved, unclaimed, unanswered. You begin with the image inherited. Irrigation, faithful and continuous. A sustaining breath mapped in water across the ground. The surface belief is tidy. Resilient channels cut and held open, season to season, by patient, practiced hands. The assumption holds that these systems, which carved urban agriculture from dust and silence, were never allowed to falter. Maintenance is imagined as perpetual, a daily ritual joining builder to harvest, structure to sustenance. Through drought, through harvest, through the settling of distant towns, the canals are presumed present, maintained with unwavering discipline. A city, it is said, was never meant to outlast its water. The line of tradition stands, unbroken, in the mind's eye. Yet something unsettles the image. The field evidence lies patient and unhurried, beneath the weight of layers. Core samples are pulled from the ancient beds, their stratigraphy neither defiant nor eager, only present, quietly inscribed with time's intention. A slow masking unfolds, almost apologetic. Each segment, each interval carries within it a compromise, a slackening. Dark humus gives way to silt. Silt blurs to a faint line of reeds, pause at the measured depths. They do not mark unwavering use, but a quiet thickening, a slow and steady aggradation, where the clean, engineered passage should remain. Bodies of data accumulate, orderly, as if waiting for recognition rather than judgment. There are descriptions, written in calibrated calm, percent organic matter rising, bulk density drifting downward, softness where firmness is required. These are not the hallmarks of ceaseless repair. Instead, the records catch what is unsaid. Coarse detritus broken only by the brittle signatures of plant macrofossils. Residue collects in a way that resists regular removal. If the channels had been recut with the discipline once imagined, the profile would tell a different story. Instead, organic interludes, bands of debris, repeated absences of gravel and sand, become their own mute witnesses. The canal, once a consonant of design, now becomes a palimpsest, its original intention half erased. Elsewhere, the remains of engineered linings emerge, half embedded in the earth. They preserve a chronology not of continuity, but of intervals repairs recognized, not as thread in an unbroken weave, but as patches upon quiet failure. Mortar washed into lines dissolving, reformed, and then neglected. Eyes tracing these fractures register not the serenity of maintenance, but the heavier impression of collapse, dressed lightly in repair. Within the matrix, silence accumulates profoundly. Repairs trace the shape of urgency left unresolved. Walk the banks, slow and contemplative, instead of regular horizons sharply recut. Their edges, recent and insistent, what stretches is the long, undisturbed shadow of unworked profiles. Sections where the topmost soil gently slopes, unbroken by the engineer's spade, thickening instead by the slow geometry of abandonment. In the channel wall, no sharp seam or recent incision disrupts the sequence, only the unaltered, accumulating presence of undisturbed strata. The science is mute but inexorable. Each unworked layer marks not a moment, but the lengthening of inattention. Each receding trace steps further away from the presumption of perpetual care. Instrument logs are precise, even clinical, but within their columns is a quiet dissonance, a weight where lightness was expected, an absence of freshly recut channel, replaced by the steady, uninterrupted growth of soil and detritus. Technicians note the readings, year over year, not understanding they are recording the slow undoing of anticipation. The progress is not dramatic, but cumulative. A riverbed filling not with catastrophe, but with the ordinary presence of what was not removed. Maps begin to fill with voids. The old hydraulic loci, once blue arteries across the page, dry and soften at the edges. Spatial data records the shrinking profile, the way a watercourse becomes a faint depression, then a mapped absence. What began as design becomes omission. Over time, the infrastructure mulish, silent waits for hands that do not arrive. The archival shadow expands. The edge between engineered intention and indifferent succession widens, yet gives itself up only in increments. How quietly infrastructure can bear neglect until absence takes hold. Into this aggregate, the question is unbidden but persistent. Where, precisely, do you find the record of the last recutting? Not in a proclamation, not in a visible collapse, but in the subtle thickening. The work of hands is chronicled by its cessation as much as by its labour. You are left, again and again, not with a clear transition, but with a recurring uncertainty. When did attention fall silent? It is here in the interval, in the gathering quiet, that the evidence presses closest. Every unit of data, every observation, collects meaning by what is deferred, fractured, incomplete. The notion of endless waterkeeping recedes, uncertain within the depth of soil records and the pale collapse of stone lining. What is seen is loss held in sediment. What is not seen is maintenance passing into memory. The tense negotiation between what is engineered and what is allowed to be undone. So, as you linger at the canal's margin, among the accumulated core logs and silent artifacts, the surfaces both familiar and strange, you listen for the answer amid sediment, void, and uncut earth. What hands stopped the recutting? In the long quiet of study, you carry an old confidence. Agricultural regimes, once shaped by hands and sun and season, held steadily through the slow weather of centuries. They endured the chill, the thaw, the drift of climate. It was supposed that fields remained, cleared and seeded, and harvested in faithful repetition, resilient to the minor variances of sky and wind. The surface persists in such belief. Terraces undisturbed, boundaries clear, a repeating cycle of sowing and scything, grain and chaff mingling as before. Yet beneath this presumption, beneath earth compressed by years and forgotten footsteps, something gathers at the threshold of vision, patient and silent. The evidence accumulates, layer upon careful layer. Palynological samples drawn with slow certainty from the muted darkness of storage pits and the deep, still beds of lakes now begin to murmur another possibility. There is a complication to stability, a hesitation in the drift of the smallest grains. The record does not shout, but in its muted signals, cereal pollen declines, subtle and patient. Weeds, more adaptive and less scripted, begin to rise in the graph traced by a needle's movement or the silent archive of a microscope slide. Neither arrival nor departure is ever abrupt, but the slow exhale of change is caught, again and again, at measured depths. This is not a ruin to be entered, but a quiet corridor of numbers and shadows, each increment both promise and erasure. Glass slides are catalogued with a ritual precision, labels written in a steady hand, shelf upon shelf of laboratory boxes, catalogue numbers marking the passage from curiosity to data. Each sample, cubic centimetre, abridged from larger stories, is measured for its weight in presence and absence. Stratigraphic profiles chart the interval between one deposit and the next, unspooling a sedimentary equivalence to memory. The pollen floats, unequally dispersed, across each lens. Cereal grains, the signatures of controlled growth, domestication, again and again handled and harvested, appear at first confidently numerous. Then, in measured decline, the signal wanes. In their place, the opportunistic weeds multiply, nameless in their ambition, their arrival unchosen and often unnoticed. Beyond this, only the vague imprint of former abundance. Lake cores occupy another register, not domestic, not curated by human hand, but open to the drift of seeds riding the wind or rain. These sequence depths, each centimetre, an unnoticed winter or a lost spring. The pollen of wheat and barley, once insistent as markers of managed growth, thins and falters. The upward curve, the weed signal, is shaped not by intention, but by the slow gathering of what persists outside the neat geometry of sown fields. In the interval between a farmer's gesture and the return of uncultivated green, the core accepts all, marking no distinction but the one preserved by stratigraphic silence. Jars stand in their own silence, unearthed from the quiet dark of storage fills, domestic in scale, yet monumental in accumulation. Their interiors are packed not with grain, but with the compacted residues of use, abandonment, disturbance, a sediment above all else. Here, too, pollen persists. Samples drawn from the dust and detritus trace the same signal. Cereals receded, weeds undeterred. The jars record, as if by accident, the same drift or dispersal as the off-site lake cores, the same unbalanced economy of presence. These signals on-site and off-site, jar and core, refuse to collapse into a single account. Each source, measured and remeasured, catalogued and cross-referenced, leaves its own skew, its own hesitation. The managed field and the uncultivated margin cannot be securely divided. In the slow sequence of lab records, grain by genus, count by count, the discipline of observation yields only further ambiguity. Microphotographs mark the shape of a husk, the contour of a pollen wall, but the why and the when remain outside the frame. The grains have gone silent, placed in their boxes, archived in rooms colder and less forgiving than any storeroom or cellar. You are left to witness the tension, what stands at the edge of managed order and the drift of the unplanned, where fields are marked in pollen, in small, shifting presences, the line between intention and neglect is always under negotiation. Evidence accumulates, never tipping to answer. Each record is a boundary, and beyond it only the inference of change, the memory of fields once tended, now marked only by absence, by a silence folded into earth and glass and card catalogue. Which fields change their grain? It begins as so many things begin on the broad, silent plane of assumption. The world of ancestry is held loosely together by the comfort of continuities. Threads woven into the fabric of time, you inherit an untroubled belief. Diet remained stable, handed down through seasons and famine, through birth and death. Year follows year, the same grains, the same flesh, the old ways returning with the sun. Such is the echo you listen for. The echo you have been told must always return. History, for a while, gives you little reason to doubt. Customs persist in the traces, silent and apparently unbroken. Under the packed soil and beneath centuries of sediment, the belief rests. What was eaten before, so too after. A rhythm undisturbed by minor ripples in time. Generations align like standing stones atop one another, their sameness assumed, a living body of tradition. Here, certainty is as inert as the ground where bones wait. It is the silence of habit and repetition, a lull that smooths memory's edges. But the silence is not complete. There are the bones, quiet, unyielding, but not quite mute. The illusion of stability is troubled by what is gathered from inside them, from the collagen fibers laboriously separated and suspended in glass vials. Burials, unearthed sequentially, do not simply stack in chronological order. Instead, taken from the earth and stripped of soil, they return to the present as records, a mathematics of intake, a ledger of invisible meals. In the half-light of the laboratory, hands do not shape stories. They measure. There are tables, rows and columns. Delta 1, 3C alongside Delta 1, 5N, values entered in deliberate script, numbers eroding the comfort of presumption. The data do not speak in stories, but in isotope ratios, decimal points, and predetermined thresholds. Collagen yields, the reliability of sample provenience, sequences of calibrated burials, the raw matter of evidence, emptied of folklore, emptied of intention. Here is the material, reduced to what endures chemical scrutiny. Nothing is revealed beyond what the test will allow. Earlier burials tell their part in silence. A C3-based diet murmurs faintly in the carbon signature. These are the quiet records, the baseline, established before change, inscribed into the very substrate of the skeleton. Unspoken continuities linger in the low, familiar ratios, in the weight of numbers. They suggest a world that is not yet split, a calm before something less knowable invades. Later, with little warning, the values oscillate. The later burials return evidence that will not align neatly with what came before. The shift is subtle, then unmistakable higher C4 signals, lower nitrogen values. The numbers no longer follow the anticipated spiral. Continuity unravels under the accountant's gaze. The logic of expectation cannot repair the schism running through the tables. One set of figures yields to another, not gradually, but decisively. The margins of the laboratory record expand. New rows slip beyond the reassuring lines of the previous epoch. Again and again, the bones are re-examined. There is no testimony here, only accumulation. They are not a witness's account. They are the residue of absorption, an impartial mirroring of vanished foods. What has been ingested becomes what is measured, understood only as the body's response to whatever was placed in the mouth. Chewed, swallowed, metabolized, and at last fixed into a silent register beneath the skin. The shelves fill with these returned bodies, each sealed beneath glass lids, each an index of bodily experience reduced to neutral chemistry. They are not storytellers. They remain material. Still, what they contain is quietly insistent. Assumed repetition collides with measured difference, and there is neither witness nor author to reweave the story. Somewhere here, between low and high, between nitrogen and carbon, rests the mark of disjunction. It is measurable and yet refuses to speak the language of certainty. Nothing in this assembly allows you to assign motive. The samples are indifferent to the question of why. The distinction C3, C4, high or low, emerges only as a pattern, arising not from testimony, but from the shadow of what has gone missing. It is a record of intake, not of intention. You are left only with the cool evidence, its tabulated silence, its resistance to your searching gaze. The measured bones are returned to order, to the archiving darkness once more. Tension flickers along the boundary between expectation and observation. The question lingers, quieter for being unanswerable, heavy for being unprovable. Who ate differently? There is a comfort in patterns, in lines traced through earth, in the solemn measure of space, in the repeated gestures of interment that seem to promise continuity. One might enter an old cemetery with the expectation rooted deeply, quietly persistent that the order of the living finds its echo in the order of the dead. Graves aligned, demarcated, respected, each occupant admitted to their allotted place, each marker speaking to a life, each deposit enfolded within custom and community. In this view, the past settles itself into place, square by square, as though awaiting the respectful visitor's gaze, the dutiful hand of memory. Yet even in the measured slowness of approach, the surface gives way. Beneath the flattened grass, under the patterned rows, lies something more ambiguous, a trench, methodically opened by hands trained in the slow arithmetic of measurement and sectioning, cuts deep into strata, named only by number and context. Layers accumulate in reverse. The most recent drifts and depositions give way, inch by inch, to stains, organic residues, unspoken presences. Along the trench's darkened margins, evidence clarifies, or else dissolves familiar shapes into uncertainty. This time, expectation is disquieted by what the trench exposes. Not the silent architecture of orderly graves, but a scatter of pits, intrusive and overlapping. It begins with the form of the earth, not a single, contained grave, but a sequence of disruptions, pits that do not recognize the boundary of earlier interments, slicing through them with no reverence for continuity, disregarding the silent negotiation with those beneath. Each intrusive pit a wound reopened yields its own assemblage. Skeletons pressed together, tangled, their ages ranging widely, slight bones against broad, mature structures, the old and the juvenile in unsorted proximity. Absence of markers, interruption where there might have been intention. Plan maps scaled, precise, notations tracing the irregular outlines of the pit margins. The way one cut interrupts another, the cuneiform shorthand of trench plans pressed against the emptiness they describe. Section drawings speak of profiles. A thickness of soil, texture changes, the ghost of an earlier grave truncated by a newer excavation, yet both now elided in dust and ink. Osteological inventories follow. These lie not in the page's geometry but in the trays. Bones, stripped of warmth and arrangement, set in uniform, cool light. Each tray bears a code, a stratigraphic number tying this femur or mandible to a specific slice of earth. Age estimations, notated. Adolescent, adult, senescent. Pathology recorded, sometimes only as suggestion a healed fracture. Evidence of wear, a lesion hinting at suffering mostly lost. The assemblage resists the fantasy of familial burial. Instead, distinctions blur, biological individuality submerged beneath accidents of deposition. Chemistry intervenes. Isotope values sampled from teeth or bone, showing signatures unshared with local Earth alien, migratory, neither easily placed nor entirely explained. Time, in this stratigraphy, is less a line than a set of intersecting absences. Each pit, intrusive yet itself interrupted, becomes a record of disturbance and forgetting, rather than of preservation. Graves that once possessed form lose themselves in later activity. The record keepers note this. The context form holds the uncertainty, as it holds measurements. Where is the edge of intent? Where does one burial end and another begin? The plans do not clarify this. The section widths only highlight the ambiguity. There is no clear horizon, only the slow collapse of boundaries as pit breaches pit and bones intermix without testimony. Moment after moment, the expectation of order unwinds. Grave goods where present are broken, truncated, displaced. A vessel chopped in half by a later cut. A handful of beads scattered across stratigraphic boundaries, orphaned from the body that once carried them. Association is tentative, contested by the excavation record itself. Objects are not found in isolation, nor in the positions mapped by memory. The catalogue description is sparse. Ceramic, bronze, bone, stratifying amid the remains, carrying only provisional links to any one person or act. Again, the record tries to fix context, but the ground refuses steadiness. In the silence of post-excavation, order is reconstructed only for storage, not for understanding. Bones are cleaned, labelled, arranged in new trays, an imposed symmetry replacing the lost symmetry of burial. Context forms accumulate in silent sequence, context after context, pit after pit, intersection after intersection. The logic of archival time now overlays the chaos of earth time. So the promise of funerary order, the mirror of social continuity, remains unfulfilled. Structure is glimpsed only in the attempt to record disorder. In this zone between then and now, between anticipation and evidence, the pits unsettle. They accumulate uncertainty, they resist doctrine and refute comfort. In the dim quiet where catalogue numbers become the sole markers, the question can only hover. Unresolved, who was placed there at whose time? It begins, always, with the expectation of clarity. That the matter impressed into earth and brick carries, undisturbed and unmixed, the name and purpose of its first ordering. One hand, one reign, one act of building. Inscriptions as the silent custodian of lineage and patronage. Each stamped phrase a certitude pressed into mud, baked beneath a sun that seemed, from a distance, to promise immortality. By this reckoning, the wall becomes a document, the brick a sentence. Read together. The structure's skin and heart should yield up their authors, their intentions, their claims to the future. Such is the assumed order. A clean line, unbroken, from the hand that pressed the seal to the eye that beholds the record today. But the ground answers with other intentions. In the quiet light of a late afternoon trench, certainty proves brittle. Mud brick faces, when the earth peels gently away, show more than the smooth regularity of a single age's confidence. Instead, the surface gleams in thin, dry ridges, a palimpsest of touch and pressure. An older stamped impression emerges. The edges faint but legible, the shapes of foreign words softened by repetition. Across that first inscription, a drift of mortar has crowded in, overlaying the name beneath with the ghost of another phrase, sharper, newer, rendered in language just altered enough to betray a different moment. The stamp is not singular but layered. Mortar carries its own colour and texture, thinning here, thickening there, refusing to let one record remain undisturbed. What was written once is not erased, only veiled, only rewritten by another hand, and then by another. The field documentation is exacting. Inventory sheets unfold, dense with columned numbers and notations. Brick stamp catalogues lay out their evidence in stark order, horizontal lines, black and silent, carrying beneath their lines the insistence of method. Here is the count of each variant in each course. Here, the trench coordinate. North 12.4, east 7.7 fixed, unyielding, and patient as memory held in stone. Impressions are laid bare to the lens, photographed in situ. The play of afternoon sunlight on the rough, dust-tinged surface, trapped forever inside the frame. Each record stamp, count, impression, location, an assertion of what was found, yet never of what must have happened. Stratigraphic sheets, cross-reference layers and contacts, tracing the logic of deposition backward through the accumulation of silences. In several places, The record is mute but suggestive. 3 distinct names, carved in separate generations and languages, placed side by side within a single course, each name bracketed by mortar of a slightly altered composition. Successive occupancy, written not in the layering of walls upon walls but in the coexistence of their constituent parts. The line, assumed unbroken, now flickers, its continuity compromised by the logic of reuse. Memory is not additive, but recursive the same bricks. Recalled, reset, repercussed. There is no commentary in the documentation, only the discipline of sequence. Photo contexts mark the exact axis of each impression, the light and angle observed. Original stamps straddle the threshold of their first use and their adoption into later constructions. Some remain visible only as contours beneath a film of hardened mortar. Some appear twice, once in the clarity of exposure and again in the grey ambiguity of being half covered. Others vanish altogether, absorbed into the silent, dusty heart of the wall. The material record does not yield its meaning willingly. The logic of building and the logic of memory diverge in the dust. And so the evidence accumulates with quiet resolve, pushing gently against what was presumed. Patronage, long thought preserved in the regular rhythm of stamped brick and wall, loses its edge, blurring beneath the weight of layered repairs and cyclical construction. The names once claimed by a palace, by a city, by a generation, are caught in the flow of materials re-employed, their imprints surviving where mortar has not effaced the sign. The bricks themselves persist, their faces marked, their purposes multiplied. They end their service in the architecture of another ambition. The walls rise again, indifferent to the order of former names, the language of former patrons, the boundaries of former intentions. Their new host, another layer of history, another inscription commands neither total obedience nor complete erasure. The fragments of each name, each phrase, coexist uneasily, surviving not through triumph, but through contingency. What remains in the silence between, in the mortar pressed flat against an older stamp, in the blank spaces where no name is left readable, in the tension between expectation and the slow, stubborn recursion of evidence? When all is reset and the wall stands at last, whose imprint survived in the mortar, some convictions lie quiet and deep, a subtle current beneath habit, almost unnoticed. It is assumed, almost without the need for voice, that the omen series and astronomical records flowed without interruption, that the ritual movements and observational routines, once set in motion, found their path unbroken. Day follows night. Stone follows shadow, and the hand repeats what the eye observes. Continuity is an article of silent faith. One moves through a room lined with catalogue boxes and feels it an inheritance, fragile, but somehow always passed on. The repetition of ritual, the surety of record, this is the prevailing belief. The scripts remained unbroken, their sequence assured by the hushed discipline of those who watched, wrote, and remembered. Yet, one does not linger in assumption's glow for long. There, beside the neat expectation of perfection, evidence accumulates quietly, inexorably disturbing smooth continuity. The tablets themselves, the carriers of omen and sky, resist the narrative of unbroken lineages. They arrive with their own stories, their own interruptions, fragments, not wholes, silences, not proclamations. Across shelves and boxes, the pattern of gaps asserts itself, mapped in dust and in column counts. Tablets splinter in patterned ways, as though adhering to a secret geometry of loss. Abrupt terminations press up against the edge of sense, a ritual stopped in mid-phrase, an observation abandoned at the threshold of its conclusion. There is a logic here, but it is a logic of fracture, of omission made tangible. In the dim light of an archive, the observer, not a priest beneath the night sky, but a keeper of what remains. Fingers hover over catalogue numbers, columnar counts tallied, break patterns notated, changes in script hand measured with a patience almost devotional. The tablets display their peculiar order. Some columns wear the double track of differing hands, as if the record passed from one vigilance to another, and then nothing. No closing formula, no intent preserved or rescinded, only the granular margin of fired clay. Some stones stand as sudden cliffs in the script's procession, a thought left unfurled, ending mid-stroke. Others fall gently out of line, a slow sink into lacunae, the measured erosion of attention. The fragments assemble not into narrative but inventory, each gap indexed, each silence receiving a quiet name. What, then, is the meaning of this patterned absence? In register after register, the question recurs and recedes. Not every tablet lies where one expects. More than a handful rest far from the reach of temple libraries. Instead, they are pulled forth from sealed caches, outposts of preservation necessitated by circumstance, or accident, or some other obscured necessity. They sit anciently, apart, marked by their exile. Their presence in these secluded caches presses gently at the surface of assumption. Are these remnants of routine, or traces of selection, perhaps even avoidance? Whichever, their distribution troubles the quiet presumption of an uninterrupted chain. In the vault's silence, only the echo of absence answers. A further tension emerges. The catalogue distribution is not random, the loss has a shape. Columns repeatedly miss their ends, lacunae lurking precisely where ritual formula would have declared completion. The abruptness is not attached to the chaos of time's decay, but rather seems situated, as if by hand. The record's own body is patterned with uncertainty. A script hand shifts mid-column. The stroke widens or thins, and then the line ceases. There is a rhythm, but it leaves one waiting for the coda that never arrives. Each box, each tablet, encodes not only what survives, but all the silent refusals, omissions, transitions. A cross-reference against contemporaneous almanacs yields marks entries that fail to find their echo, blanks where a phrase is expected. The cross-hatching of presence and absence complicates the image of ongoing care. At the borders, certainty gives way to sediment. What is catalogued is only what survived, and what survived is as much shaped by loss as by intent. The ritual notion of textual continuity finds itself mirrored uneasily in these residues. Preservation reveals itself as selection, perhaps, or constraint. The observer, whether scholar or scribe or mere intent, moves through catalogue boxes, handling the weight and shade of the past. He counts what is present, but the enumeration leans equally toward the never copied, the unrepeated, the left behind. Those tablets which sit unremarked, sudden in their silence, imply more than neglect. Some entries, perhaps entire sequences, never survive the transition from hand to hand, from night to memory, from intention to inscription. You stand in the hush that lingers between archive and recollection. The assumption of continuity, so solid, becomes porous here. Each physical absence presses against ritual memory. The fragment opens up, not toward closure, but toward reflection. What remains is evidence and disquiet, in equal measure. Which entries were never copied? Assumptions are rarely silent, but here, among trays and remnants, the accepted story persists in low tones. Each tool better than its predecessor. The belief is unhurried. Persistent tools improve. Copper hardens into bronze, bronze into sharper, more reliable forms. The narrative threads through syllabi, finds its way into captions and footnotes, settling across the stones with the slow weight of tradition. You are invited to accept it. A progression, a climb. Yet, underneath this narrative, evidence accumulates in layers, quiet but insistent. In another room, the story wavers, not overtly disputed, just gently, persistently nudged by the lines and numbers that emerge as artifacts travel through laboratories instead of forges. Compositional analyses, anodyne phrases, but the meaning is not. Metal tools, long cooled, each carries its own silent testimony, subtle hues on fractured surfaces, paired with barcodes and archival tags. On polished samples, a beam of light divides and recollects, the spectrometer recording each element's presence and absence, etching a record deeper than surface polish. Percent compositions accumulate in columns, lead, copper, tin expected, then altered, then shifting. None announce certainty, but each measurement unsettles the promise of steady refinement. There is no single arc, only variation. Scatter. The soft drift of numbers. Trace element profiles appear. Spectral peaks mapped against provenance. These records are not loud readouts projecting quiet color on dark screens beneath laboratory lights. The numbers flicker, stabilize, leave their traces on digital storage. Across the trays, artifacts are grouped. Blades, chisels, pins, fragments of whatever tasks once shaped the day. They are sorted not merely by use, but by chemistry, by what is found in their core, in the memory of their making. In some caches, the evidence tightens. Abruptness resides in the data, not the artifact. Higher tin bronzes dominate one stratum, clean and definite, the kind of alloy that rings when struck. Then, without gradation, a turn. New artifacts, almost contiguous in the soil, show lower alloy mixes, paler, softer, less certain. The shift resists the narrative of incremental improvement. There is no gentle transition, no intermediate blend to link past to present, just a clean break. A silence between numbers where expectation should find continuity. The old story dissolves, not in the presence of something shocking, but in the absence of what should be there. The middling alloys, the gradual learning, the evidence of process unfolding in disciplined steps. Conservation trays lie beneath dustless glass, each holding its calm fragment once burning, now cold. Tags name source locations, where the ore might have come from, what hands may have worked it. These names are speculative, partial, resolved only as much as the isotopes will allow, and that is not much. The memory of movement, of an ore's path to the furnace, and then the forge, is no longer animate. Only silent hints remain, percentages of tin dropping, veins of copper no longer traceable in the same way. The trays hold more than tools, they hold the absence of what was once certain. Weeks pass in the laboratory, records swelling. The objects do not speak, but their chemistry resists the urge to make them tell one single story. The evidence is multi-layered scatterplots rather than arrows, pools rather than flows. Provenance assessments tie each fragment back to dirt, to sites collected and catalogued decades apart, to excavation contexts now more memory than soil. In these records, you see not sequence, but interruption. The tools cool in conservation trays, slowly drawing away from the hands that shaped them, growing quieter as questions grow larger. Technological expectation faces the chemical archive, and it is the archive that holds sway. Tin, then less tin, and the break is sharp. Alloy ratios that are neither neat nor gradual, sources that cease or fragment. The promise of seamless progress gives way to the record's patient, unresolvable notation. Nothing here completes itself. What arrives is provisional, proximate. Sometimes, the silence between measures is the loudest thing left in the room. Absence takes on form. The missing ores, the untravelled routes, the alloys that never quite materialized. Which ores stopped arriving? There is a familiar outline, well-worn and unexamined, that stands at the base of received wisdom. Trade, as it moved across distances, composed itself into orderly channels, familiar nodes, and habitual shores. Between each horizon, the network was presumed continuous. Pulses tracing a reliable geography, each commodity travelling in measured sequence from source to destination. The centuries have favoured such a model, a promise of predictability, of regularity, of reliable rhythm. The notion persists, quietly persistent. Long-distance routes, joined in concert, each city and harbour responding in time, each shipment marking a beat in the exchange. It is an architecture built of expectation, maintained by the discipline of assumption. The circle appears whole, the exchange unbroken, the traffic ceaseless and intact. Beneath this surface, however, a chord falters. In the quiet, temperature-stable dark of the archive, the evidence waits, unhurried, indifferent to expectation. Trade ledgers, the painstaking labour of merchant houses, emerge as countermeasures against the calm terrain of assumption. There, in the steadiness of ink against the pale fibrous page, a different rhythm is latent, a staccato pattern breaking the imagined flow. Commercial records, in their relentless categorization, reveal less a seamless circuit than a map with sudden blanks, shipments running towards silence, names inscribed and left without echo. The evidence arrives not with declaration, but with restraint, pages secured in folders, stamped and numbered. Each spine, each archival envelope, offers incrementally the story of a journey begun but not completed. Destinations are written in columns, each overseen by the delicate curve of script, measured and repeated. Tyros, Myros, the place across the estuary. Commodities, grain, olive oil, indigo, are tallied in a language of counting. Beside them, merchant names, always in the same hand, always followed by the hard, oval impress of seal impressions pressed into wax or clay. This, too, is evidence, the shape of authority, the provisional shape of trust. But the most insistent testimony resides in the voids these ledgers meticulously record. Along the margins, annotated dates appear, small marks that indicate an expectation. Yet these entries are unresolved, left to trail off, the ledger closing in tentative silence. For many, there is no twin in the archives to which they were sent. Counterpart records, once expected to announce the reception or dispatch of goods, refuse to surface. The exchange anticipated between distant partners' contracts, leaving only a one-sided note. Shipments sent out over water or road, met by silence. The ledgers do not grieve. They simply record emptiness with the same patience as abundance. It is not absence alone that unsettles, but the pattern within it. Routes that terminate, itineraries that dissolve into nothing. A shipment of wool assigned to Byblos, annotated, sealed, but never answered. A convoy of amphorae, their tally complete and confirmed at departure, then failing to be named again in any surviving record. These are not isolated gaps, but seams repeated across years, as if certain routes, certain forms of contact, were subject to demure and invisible forces, not catastrophe, not even disruption, but withdrawal into silence. The ledgers know no cause. They list, they count, they close their covers around discrepancies without comment. Administered silence, recorded in the archival night. Placed in boxes, those ledgers lie beneath a controlled hum, spectral air and darkness, protecting, delimiting, enclosing what is left. The paper, the ink, the imprint of a seal, they persist longer than those who scribe them. Yet the rhythms of their testimony are partial, provisional, suggesting an order just out of reach. You find yourself returning to the same columns, retracing with your eye the same dates, compelled less by what is supplied than by what is missing. The pattern is not merely documentary, but elegiac. At the threshold between what was and what is preserved, the ledgers whisper the shape of a vanished response. Why do certain connections dissipate, leaving only these unresolved annotations, these sealed but unanswered entries, these routes tending towards silence? The question cannot be resolved here. The ledgers do not yield cause, only evidence for the tension they inscribe. Between the model of continuous exchange and the administrative silence at each vanished edge, a lacuna persists. Something is neither confirmed nor denied. The finality of archival quiet asserts itself again, insistent and cold. You may imagine the warehouses, half emptied, receipts matched to goods already faded from record. You envision clerks, their hands steady, eyes resigned, entering the date of expected receipt, the name of a distant agent, never to return to annotate completion. The ledgers remain, boxed, ordered, demure. Each line is a question asked into darkness, an assertion of expectation that has, somehow, failed to endure. What is left, after order, registration, and hope of response, is simply the unresolved line, a ledger closed, a silence held, a history blind at its terminus. Across each increment, the inquiry does not soften. It is only folded back into the hush of paper, the drift of unbroken quiet. Each gap, each omission is recorded deliberately, as if the very act of noticing might someday return an answer. Which shorelines ceased to answer? To see a seal pressed into clay, sharply incised, is to encounter bureaucracy as fact. It is to recognize, almost reflexively, the presence of a steady hand, an official eye, a continuity of oversight. The formulaic emblem, routine yet weighty, suggests a structure unbroken, a line drawn from the chamber of authority to the margins of daily life without interruption. Each impression, complete and deliberate, compels belief in unyielding order. You are invited, quietly, to accept a world where every marker implies an administration whose reach is whole, whose resolve is continual, whose signatures are proof of its sovereign thread. But the clay betrays another story. In the layered sediment of centuries, within the silent bruising of collapsed walls and rearranged earth, the impressions do not align. The same emblem, produced at the same office by matrices meant to bear witness to legitimacy, appears neither in linear sequence nor in predictable progression. Some surfaces, once aligned beside others of their kind in the orderly gloom of archive rooms, emerge instead, years or lifetimes later, stratified, discontinuous, divorced from any direct administrative line. The official seal, meant as a guarantee of presence, now recedes behind the silt of its own aftermath. The observations are methodical. They are not the product of narrative or speculation or backward vision, but the result of patient cataloguing, of meticulous record-keeping, and the disciplined construction of data. Each impression, when uncovered, is measured for motif, for composition, for mount and medium. Matrix patterns are drawn, indexed, rendered monochrome, against a white page, the distinctive wave of a border, the symmetrical bearing of an emblematic creature. Contextual mapping fixes each artifact within the matrix of site and level. Ground broken here. Stratum assigned there. Found wedged in a corridor fills 6 meters east of the lintel, or half collapsed amid calcined reeds. Each one is inked, preserved, and entered into the silent ledger. But these impressions, though identical in form, resist the logic of sequence. Some rest shoulder to shoulder amid the dust of high-status archive rooms, where their presence one imagines once denoted the living heart of administration. Others, no less perfect, surface centuries later in debris, dissolved from the context of power, mingled with the residue of ordinary dwellings. The hand that pressed them is gone, the station that assigned them, untraceable. A paradox forms, continuity of symbol, dispersal of meaning. What should have proven order, instead, speaks of entropy, a scattering of marks across time and ruin, each one a static assertion whose voice can no longer be placed. The act of recording amplifies this estrangement. Every entry, every grayscale photograph, and measured line drawing is itself removed from contact with the hands that impressed the seal. The voices that ordered its production, the evidence compressed under centuries of dust, remains mute yet meticulously organized. Clay composition analyses yield numbers and grains, not motives. The matrices reveal pattern, not process. In catalogues, the identical is separated, the contiguous divided. One impression on red-flecked marl, another on pale, silty local clay, both bearing the same azure dye, both stamped by the matching seal edge worn along the lower quadrant. In the record, the sameness is as pronounced as the distance. Each notation only heightens the interval between object and origin. It is tempting, perhaps, to read these disjunctions as transition or interruption, moments of collapse, shifts in power, movements out of darkness, but the evidence does not comply with narrative. It suspends itself between the archive and the residue, the signature and the ruin. Silence gathers around each impression, an absence not illuminated by context. You find yourself returning, in thought, to the gap between intention and preservation. There are ghost offices, spaces of administration whose mark exists but whose tenure does not cohere. Which records reflect broken lines rather than integrity? which authorities left no continuous shadow to follow through the veils of dust and dispersal. The impressions, again and again, are inked in books. Sterile, sharp-lined, flattened. Their context is frozen, yet the temporal gulf yawns wider with every page. Under glass, under light, in the hands of observers, witnesses who document, but can only suggest the seal, impressions wait. It is not the claim of power that is preserved, but the puzzle of its remains. Each marker interrupts the assumption it was meant to secure, each recurrence breaking the imagined flow of authority into fragments without evident junction. The official hand, once supposed to be ever present, flickers and is diffused, its traces clutched by neither archive nor ruin, only by observation itself. What is it we truly inherit when all that survives is the isolated impression, not the unbroken chain of command? The expectation endures, quiet and unchallenged. In the arrangement of stone corridors and closed chambers, in the measured passages of time demarcated by ritual, the assumption seems natural. A temple's life is a cycle of continuous provision. Each offering made, each portion measured, each name inscribed. One imagines the ledgers, orderly and unbroken, multiplying in the cool stillness behind sealed storeroom doors. Temporal habit becomes liturgy. To account is to assure, and to record is to perpetuate. Provision appears unceasing, carefully documented, unvarying. This is the comfort of the uninterrupted inventory. Yet the evidence rests beneath layers of earth, folded into the silence beneath collapsed ceilings. Excavation reveals not a seamless tapestry, but artifacts of omission and interruption. Tablet after tablet is brought to light, surfaces scored with columns and the rhythms of hands recording weight, quantity, designation, name. A procession of regular entries, types of offerings, measurements taken with care. Then, unexpectedly, there is absence. A column which should enumerate offerings ends prematurely. A tally dissolves into lacunae, as if a hand paused and could not go on. Order is interrupted within routine itself. Another tablet, another column, yet this too is incomplete. The excise lists, once assumed to be steadfast, reveal omissions sudden and unexplained. Pages of ritual arithmetic now possess empty spaces, where ceremonial certainty faltered. The cataloguer's eye dwells here, poised between what is and what fails to be. The testaments are preserved not in imagination, but in clay, their geometry determined by the slow uncurling of archaic script, their continuity by the architectonics of storage. You stand, perhaps, before a sheet of glass. Behind it, the inventory glimmers faintly in the museum's controlled light. The tablets are clustered, measured, already diminished by time, and by the fire-ravaged ceilings above which once enclosed them. You observe faint grids, one for types of offerings, wine, grain, incense, implied but unnamed by the gaps. One for weights, numeric shadows progressing and then halting. Another for frequency, disrupted by erasure, as if months vanished or seasons were unmarked. Names of priests stand in rows that thin and stutter, a register of presences that end in blankness, their signatures withdrawn. Silence accumulates not only in the storeroom, but in each missing sum. These tablets, it is written, were sealed in darkness for counting, calculated on shelf and on floor, wrapped in faint traces of oil and soot. When the roof fell, it arrested the record in situ, where it was last left, perhaps unfinished, perhaps abandoned for reasons unrecorded. The difference is indistinguishable. There is the before, order, intention, ritual necessity. There is the after, dust, collapse, a register that can no longer be fully deciphered. What resided in regularity is now encased in rupture. So the evidence unfolds itself in layered quiet. With each column, a measure of presence, with each void, a measure of absence, both reproduced in the controlled air of the museum and in the slow, uncertain gaze of the observer. The anticipated regularity, the imagined completeness, is rendered partial by the stone's own testimony. You trace the incisions with your eyes, fingers pressed against cool glass, each interruption a whisper, a column begun and never concluded, a tally that ends not with a total, but with a space. Lacunae are more than mere accidents. They are preserved as meanings negative, held open for scrutiny. Inventory, though taken, is not complete. The context sheets do not translate the silences into narrative, nor do they attempt to. Attention hangs suspended at the margin of loss. This was sealed and counted, yet it is now fractured and unresolved. The tablets beneath their glass are both artifact and unanswered question. The administrative record, surviving only as it was left, cannot restore what it omits but quietly gestures to what failed to be registered. Time moves differently here. The records speak, then falter. The collapse settles dust in the rafters and seals absence within stone. In catalogue form, the museum's care offers no resolution, only preservation, a sheltering of the partial, an archive of what was not fully observed. Routine is visible in the sequence, but rhythm dissolves into spaces you cannot enter. The past offers only partial witness, its silence echoing through enumeration. There is tension, unvoiced and indivisible, between the ritual's demand for repetition and the incompleteness of what survives. Which offerings were no longer registered? It is quietly held, almost axiomatic. A household's ways of storing reflect its seasons of plenty, or its months of wanting, that the pulse of abundance and the hush of scarcity inscribe themselves faithfully on storerooms and vessels, that the physical routines and architectures of containment echo the rhythms of harvests and drought. Patterns are presumed to be gradual, the ebb and flow visible in each generation's slight rearrangement of jars and stones. Each year's small accumulation of residue thickening along the rim. The comfort of this story lies in its persistence. Containers as mute witnesses to steady change, echoed from courtyard to corner, from neighbour to neighbour. Yet beneath this smooth telling, shadows lengthen. Layer by layer, what the earth returns strains at the edges of this expectation. The evidence, obsessive in its quiet detail, unfolds not as a gentle transition, but as rupture, as unresolved dissonance. Cataloguers trace the outlines, cold rims emerging from soil, rim diameters indexed in notebooks, each jar assigned a number, a box, a label, the record a collation of measured silences. Here, row upon row, storage jars assemble an inventory with no easy narrative. The maps lay bare their positions, the broad courtyards once central to collective keeping, now nearly empty, their stones indented only by dust where bases once sat. In neighbouring rooms, sealed jars cluster where none were expected, pressed beneath hearths or arrayed along the thresholds of private chambers. There is no clear procession from communal to private, no gradual reshuffling marked by layers of transition or discarded forms cast between. Instead, the absence of intermediacy, the suddenness, like jars spirited in the dark, their movement unmarked and uncelebrated. The residue analysis deepens the pause. Each vessel's inner skin, shorn and sampled, releases history's particulate and partial grains, faint oils, a smear of pulse or seed, the unsteady signature of what once filled, emptied, filled again. The reports file these residues in columns. The granary's jars, once touched by all, retain old traces only at their base, while the newly clustered hearthside vessels show fresher layers, tightly packed, sealed against intrusion. On one sheet, the rim diameters are measured to the millimetre, the slight divergence between series quietly inscribed, suggesting that what appears unified might conceal a sequence of replacement or exchange. The difference is almost silent, hardly enough to name, yet it threads unease through the archive. The storeroom's wholeness dissolves in these numbers. The logic of steady abundance yields to something sharper, more abrupt, something unspoken in the register. Maps offer a parallel silence. The lines demarcate what is known. Grids of space, arrows of movement. The distance between the last communal jar excavated and the first assemblage found in a back chamber, mere steps yet divided by something opaque. Time, intention, necessity, unspecified. There are flaws, contemporaneous by all observable stratigraphy. where mixed refuse and the irregular scatter of worked sherds imply not a process but an event. And beneath the poured clay of a hearth, a sealed jar, preserved intact, contents undisturbed, as if waiting for hands that did not return. The spatial record resists narrative smoothing. The witnesses are jars, their mouths closed, their labels mute, the sequence of placement and removal. Their choreography in the darkness is not here. The material remains, their logic difficult to fold into the old story. In the archive, the count accumulates a list by room, by cluster, by layer, by absence, each tally an act of attending to what is missing as much as what is present. Quiet and unresolved, between the practiced arrangement of storage, a system assumed to be honed and continuous, and this record of abruptness, of unsettlement. The anticipated narrative would have found jars trickling from courtyard to corridor, communal storerooms giving ground step by step to private hearths, perhaps the residue thinning and thickening in response. Instead, the evidence hints at simultaneous presence and absence, steady routines at the surface, cracked by rearrangement below. The stratigraphic note records sealed vessels beneath new floors, the detritus of daily life mingling above, as if what was and what followed are pressed together with no mediating layer to explain, to soothe, to transition. The jars now rest in boxes, the labels methodical, the inventory complete but insufficient, their history still partitioned, unresolved. The imagined scrape of ceramic in the threshold's shadow, but nothing in the record permits a certainty of movement, of intention, of voice. The silence remains undisturbed. Time settles, slow and recurring, sifting the dust above the rim, pressing the story further from reach. Memory, if it lingers, lingers as absence, as the ache of reorderings that leave no explanation, no reason, only the evidence's mute resistance to closure. The story was simple. Or so it once seemed. Water, so essential and persistent, was thought to have kept pace with those who gathered above its table settlement and plan moving hand in hand. City adjusting, population swelling, and the wells responding. Gradually, deliberately, each generation building incrementally, attentive and aware, mapping necessity into the urban grid through a slow choreography of adjustment. Step by step, stone by stone, the old belief echoed. As the city filled, so too did its answers to thirst. The wells deepening in thoughtful dialogue with every boundary marked on the ground above, every house, every courtyard. That was the shape of the assumption, rounded and reassuring, an urban rhythm as measured as the ticking of a clock. Water would always be there, rising to meet the bucket, predictable as morning. But then, the record silent, meticulous, intransigent, opens its ledger, and the shape blurs. These wells, so long accepted as evidence of slow and sensible adaptation, present themselves otherwise. The archive reveals not the gentle undulation of steady descent, but the abruptness of thresholds crossed almost in the dark, unnoticed. In the sediment and in the stone, the evidence accumulates in layers both physical and temporal. One reads it not just in the words of reports, but in the material remains. Section drawings, fine and spare, mapping depth in increments, notches denoting meters descending into the earth, each drawing a registration of an absence, a depth reached only because another was no longer sufficient. The surfaces are lined in masonry, canonical types, catalogued with careful hands, each stone a choice, but also a timestamp, lined first and then, in certain wells, lined again, but differently. Newer linings knitted awkwardly to the old. It is not continuity one sees, but an articulation, a break in the record. Why this sudden deepening, after years, perhaps lifetimes, of stasis? There is no slow sedimentation in the architecture. Instead, there are abrupt seams where the structure drops, plunges, reshaped by necessity as if overnight, the lower stones pressed into service to chase something withdrawing beneath. The field records do not interpret. They do not comfort. They describe depth measured, lining catalogued, age inferred, masonry joined, and sometimes misaligned, marked with a line between then and hurried now. Into the well mouth, an observer lowers a line, feeling for the bottom, marking a number in the logbook, tracing a descent that is not linear, not smooth. Elsewhere, from fill and residue at intervening levels, samples are drawn, labelled, and later examined microfauna, the silent indicators of abandonment, the dying off of what once thrived at that shallower reach. These tiny creatures, extracted from sediment, serve as witnesses to a world withdrawing, their numbers thickest at one level, only to thin and vanish as water fell deeper into the ground. In the measured, ritual repetitions of documentation, linen sheets with section diagrams, lists of masonry types, columns of numerical depths, one feels the gravity of something pressed, something lost. The observer aligns drawings from years apart. The early, shallow, well broad and certain. The widened shaft below, narrower, awkwardly grafted to what remains above, as if chasing receding hope. Each newly added depth is not a mere footnote, but a testament to rapid adjustment at an uncertain border, recorded in stone but issued from silence. The very sequence of linings and fills, the abrupt extensions forced into the ground, generates tension, silent but insistent. There is the trace of planned adaptation. Yes, not forgotten, not erased but eclipsed, pressured by something subterranean and swift. Hydrological urgency, not civic reason, pressed the stones deeper. Yet the stones do not explain. They neither confess nor clarify. They simply give measure, depth below the surface, type of brick, pattern of mortar. All else is inference, unwelcome, unbidden. And so the field report turns back to quiet, offering chronology but withholding cause. They wait under the surface, shaped by hands no longer present, silent as the paper that tries to remember them. Reports describe what can be seen. Spots of misaligned brick, a sudden dark line where new work began, microfauna, shifting in the dust of dried-out floors. But they do not recount the first moment, when the bucket went down and met only air. Absence becomes another form of record, as potent and pressing as what is left behind. The empirical sequence is a counterpoint to the narrative of steady adaptation. It is measured, charted, lined, but it is also a wound. In this investigation, the traces multiply, but what they show is not a slow reveal, but the echo of something that happened quickly, too quickly to be fully seen, too quickly to register, except as effect. One returns, and returns to the quiet stone, to the catalogued depths, to sediment sorted and stored. Each return is an act of patience and recognition, circling the question that the evidence cannot answer, cannot even quite articulate. It is a quiet expectation, almost tacit. The monumental project rises in the collective mind, a palace precinct drawn in ink, mapped on stone, envisaged as testament. The standard account runs undisturbed. These walls are more than boundaries. They are records of resolved ambition, framed prosperity coaxed from quarry into facade. To witness a great work unfold is to sense the gravity of completion, even as the dust is swept from the scaffolding boards, every contour, every elevation promising continuation toward conclusion. Completion as a form of assurance, as if stone could silence all doubt. The blueprint imagines nothing left unresolved. It is assumed these intentions carry through, stone laid atop stone, plans incarnated fully in earth, lime, and time. Yet the archive resists the serenity of closure. Between what was plotted and what persists, a thin but unyielding layer settles, the record of interruption. In the palace core, cut strata whisper with layers halted in their ascendancy. Walls do not quite meet their imagined edge. Faces meant for limewash or paint stand raw to the weather, surfaces shattered mid-gesture. The anticipation of a finished structure quietly dissolves. The walls, meant to enclose and impress, pause in their emergence, neither rising nor falling, hanging between intention and silence. Certain facings begin ashlar set and squared yet end abruptly, their margins frayed, as if time thinned and wandered off elsewhere. A slow circuit of the precinct's remnants insists upon the unresolved. Scaffolding post holes ring the wall base, regular as punctuation, but no overlaying strata mark the passage to finished height. In the dust, imprints hold the measure of absent timber, the suggestion of upward ambition left wanting. Where header courses should interlock, economic in their distribution, systematic in their resistance to pressure, there is instead a wavering succession. Mortar, once wet and resolute, is sampled, ground between index and thumb. The recipe is correct, the lime clear, but sections remain unbedded, never receiving the seal of the builder's finishing tool. Under scrutiny, the stone betrays itself sharp-edged, untrimmed. Its arises unsoftened by plaster or paint, unlikely to have greeted the hand that writes of harvest and revel. There is no overture to completion, only the settled hush of abandonment. The elevation drawings, so precise in ruling, surrender nothing extra to optimism. Where their measured notations predict a header, an angle, a moment of symmetry, the physical structure holds back. Markings that should have come stamped dates, faint mason's lines, the flick of ochre to signify approval remain uninscribed. Silence pervades, not of the anticipated celebratory kind, but the quieter hush of progress stilled mid-breath. Even in the archives, the plans stack up, gathering stillness of their own. The dust along vellum edges and the faint must of forgotten ink recapitulate the lull found outside, where half walls project both vision and vacancy. As the sun passes and shadow moves across facets neither disguised nor adorned, absence becomes the dominant record. Pause here, at the liminal surface where expectation met occurrence. Each observation reveals its own delay strata exposed, tools removed but not replaced, surfaces left untouched since the day ambition failed to fully resolve stone upon stone. The half-wall is neither plainly new nor gracefully ruined. Instead, it persists as evidence of something begun but never sealed, its meaning lodged somewhere between the scaffolding's impression and the sky's indifference. The careful record-keepers do not reach for description beyond the visible. They note what is not there: elevation never reached, headers never keyed, mortar never finished, faces never smoothed. The register is plain, paced by absence. Nothing is attributed, nothing inferred beyond what stone will bear. An untouched finishing slab, set aside perhaps for a next phase, now lies mottled amid weeds. Its promise remains, but the wall next to it is unadorned, exposed to rain and night. The record endures quietly in each omission. The inexplicable end, the work's unfinished sides, the evidence of things left waiting, these remain the only testimony. Sometimes, if you listen between the layers of dust, the tension asks to be heard. Planned grandeur resting, interrupted, collecting in the archive, just as stone collects shadow in the silent precinct. There is no echo of completion, only pooled quiet of halted phases, of unfinished faces, of decoration never realized. The walls mark presence and interruption equally. Their silence is neither accidental nor explained, but written into the built world's memory. In this place, the evidence is not what rises triumphantly, but what stops short and waits. Which facades were never finished. It is often assumed quietly, with the reassurance of routine, that the contents of graves neatly mirror the patterns of exchange and display that shape the worlds of the living. The idea lingers, persistent and almost comforting. To open a grave is to take the measure of a network, to trace the flows of wealth, to see knotted histories in the objects placed beside the bones. Metal, stone, something bright from elsewhere, a language of presence and connection. It is easy, almost automatic, to map the outline of wealth across a landscape of burials, to let the repetition of imported objects confirm that long-distance ties held, even as generations slipped away. But evidence interrupts. The records speak in sequence, not in certainty. A phase emerges, slower to reveal itself than the clarity the mind demands. You observe the graves, row by row, moving through time by sediment and silence. Somewhere along the ledger, the pattern frays. The imported goods fall away with a pause that feels like the catching of breath. Where once grave inventories opened to reveal materials whose origins could be traced far beyond the village, there is now a residue of the local, a substitution that accumulates quietly and persistently. The weight of a bead, the touch of worked bronze or polished stone, their edges dulled by years and handling a shift in provenance, documented but unspeaking. The catalogue tells its story without flourish. Inventories marked by grave number, methodical notations of origin. Item after item is listed, measured, assessed. Early graves in the phase still offer the comfort of recognition. Their objects pointing outward, signalling connection. A stone from distant hills, a metal torque from a place only guessed at, their surfaces worn by touch and transit. Later, the ledger closes with entries that circle ever more tightly, provenance shortened to a leap across a valley, or a gathering from the river's drift. You look at the controlled photographs, each frame a silent witness, surface and context frozen and then filed. The early graves, glinting beneath layers of soil, display the unmistakable evidence of distant hands. Someone else's tool marks, worked into decorative patterns. The artifacts might be small, but their presence is unmistakable, confirming the expected choreography of trade and distance. For a while, perhaps a span no one now can measure, this pattern endures, and then it is gone. What remains is methodically assessed. A record keeper's hand, impartial, has written up the inventories in careful sequence. Metal and stone items, each with a suggested provenance, or simply marked as local, uncertain, or untraced. These are the words that slip in as the catalogue advances. The stone loses its identity. The metal loses its journey. The difference is not in what is found, but in what cannot any longer be traced. Sometimes dust, sometimes an impression in soil, where something delicate vanished before the grave ever saw the light again. There is a tension here, one that refuses to resolve itself into explanation. The expectation is that exchange networks sustain themselves, that the flows of objects will leave their imprint even as bones crumble and wood vanishes. Yet the graves insist otherwise. The material diminishes, not just in quantity but in the implication of distance. By the time the cemetery phase draws to a close, the ledgers contain fewer and fewer acknowledgements of the world beyond. Objects nested in context, yes, but their stories contracting, dimming, receding into locality. You return to the records, seeking a cause in the method, but the patterns repeat only their silence. Each inventory, opened, measured, photographed, but ultimately mute. The sequence is clear, but its meaning unspoken. Did the lineages lose their access or standing, or did the networks themselves fray and curl inwards? Away from prying eyes and measure, the absence sits heavily, a ledger closed without totality. And so, the graves close in the ledger, column after column narrowing, the catalogue a study in subtraction as much as presence. What is absent accumulates, a slow migration from expectation to emptiness. The grave goods, once tokens of reach, are now emblems of a different sort, objects traded between forgetting and memory. The witnesses of the present, observers and record keepers alike, are left only with negative evidence, a pattern that was and then was not. They look and record, unsure. The record lingers, but offers only its gaps. The expectation persists in the quiet spaces between shelf and folder, a slow and almost ceremonial belief that legal and administrative language shapes itself in tune with the mineral patience of the tablets that bear it. In the mind's eye and in the cataloguer's ledger, the scripts are meant to move with a kind of deliberate inevitability, clauses tracing careful arcs through centuries. Phrase meeting, phrase in an orderly procession. Things are given their due time, or so it has been assumed. The language of the law, fixed by tradition, unfolding in slow increments, unchanged and unchanging as stone. This is the comfort, the unspoken covenant between archive and observer. Change, when it arrives, will signal itself faintly, barely brushing the outermost edges of formula and sign. The past is stable, a surface from which traces may be lifted but rarely disturbed. A corpus of legal texts, its boundaries well defined by provenance and shelf mark, begins to drift under the lens. Stylistic shifts render familiar templates unfamiliar. The compression is unmistakable. Within a brief progression of tablets, folios that by their sequence should adhere to the expected tempo abbreviation asserts itself. Formulae are paired. The sprawling clauses lose their depth, become compact. A sense of acceleration, almost inaudible, but present in the filaments of the script. The evidence destabilizes the comfortable view, not by an act of aggression, but by a steady erosion of the long-held shape of things. The shift is not in argument or decree, but in the settlement of ink and the pressure of stylus. You find yourself observing not grand declarations, but the accumulation of small, patient disruptions. The philological evidence refuses to raise its voice. Instead, it marks its presence in the margins and the columns, in the careful notations of the hand. Hands compared, sign frequency recorded with the dispassion of a recorder, intent only on what the surface yields. Each tablet, isolated, then returned to its sequence. Charts are compiled and quietly consulted. The dates of tablets are cross-referenced, not merely with the imprecision of guesswork but with a calibrated eye. Scales balanced between strokes and motifs. In the ledgers, a paleographic reckoning unfolds, neutral and exact. The earlier texts stretch out, unhurried, laden with clauses that seem, in retrospect, almost excessive. Their diction lingers, an echo that suffuses the folios. But as the sequence advances, the writing contracts. What was once expansive resolves into the terse. The formulae condense. Long clauses let go of their ornament. What remains is efficient, almost sparse. The orthography fails to settle. Variant spellings appear between tablets drawn from the same shelf, the same hand, at times even on the same page. There is no argument made for or against. It is simply permitted to be visible, a splay of forms dispersed across stone. These moments gather, sedimentary, in the acid-free folders that cradle the scripts. The tactile assurance of hard-won preservation stands in contrast to the volatility of language held within. The scripts sleep, undisturbed, their loss silently registered in every form that fails to appear where it once stood. The process is archival, not declarative, a matter of arranging, rearranging, not of making pronouncements. Variation slides beneath expectation, waiting to be measured. In this junction, the curve between belief and evidence, a tension reveals itself. The tradition, so often imagined as seamless through time, meets the compression of necessity. The materials teach their own lessons. Stone disintegrates with touch, but writing erodes from within, clause by clause, gesture by gesture. The page becomes thinner, the silence louder. One cannot say which dictates the other. You return to the texts, their order both familiar and uncertain. You sift the fragments, index the drafts, log the metrics. You compare. The differences bring no resolution, only further divergence. A palette of possibility, rendered more enigmatic by each review. There is only the cumulative presence of loss, punctuated by what remains legible, retained, exacted. The archives wait. Their silence both answer and question. No narrative draws itself to a close. The tablets whisper only stories of transformation endlessly beginning. The measured pace. Where has it receded in these narrow corners of the record? In the acid-free silence, you wait beside the scripts, repositories of both compression and omission. Shadow and dust linger at the edge, pressing up against the formal logic of sequence and archive. You pause in the cool hush of the stacks, fingertips pressing faint impressions into catalogue numbers, knowing each moment is a threshold. Folio referenced, hand analysed, sign counted, still there is only the record, not the reason. Preservation seems a simple thing. Land cultivated, season after season, generation, shadowing generation. The offered belief rests quietly, unquestioned, that these plots, these furrowed margins of habitation and intention, retain a fidelity, their crops sturdy, deliberate, bounded by what was sown, holds itself against the murmur of outside seeds, keeping to lineage, keeping to purpose. Fields, year by year, are imagined as extensions of settled will, preferred varieties enduring by virtue of repetition and care. The assumption rests, patient and dense, as if embedded in the soil itself. Evidence collects discreetly, almost apologetically. It does not raise its voice, but gathers all the same in storerooms dark and patient, at the rough edge of the fields, along margins where intention lags behind necessity. Archaeobotanical samples, unassumingly labelled, quietly call this belief into question. The jars remain sealed, envelopes sealed and penciled with dates and code, but within, the small shift begins. Seed counts quietly accumulate, dispassionately tallied. Species are identified, not always with easy certainty. Some, expected grain, barley, the known cultivars, but alongside them, an increase in those others. The uninvited, the opportunistic, the stubbornly persistent signatures of something unfurling beyond design. A sample, weighed and dispersed, separated by sieves, floated in water until fragments rise, one by one, to a dish beneath the lens. Each component is isolated, counted. There are more now seeds, not consistent with planting lists, signs of plants less desired, invasive, opportunistic. Their appearance is careful, cumulative, no great incursion, but a steady turning. A margin here, a scatter within storage, a presence caught between the hoped for and the actual. The preferred cultivars, in the records, show a thinning. A line decreases, grain by grain. Each seed is preserved in context. In packed jars once stowed in darkened stores, in loose scatterings across floors where loss and abundance intermingle. The laboratory unfolds them, each envelope a small reliquary of another time's intention and accident. Stratigraphic links are taken, layers calibrated to a chronology measured not in years, but in accumulations of dust and decline. What is revealed is not a narrative, but an arrangement, a juxtaposition. Here, the ideal. Dense, pure grains. There, the encroachment. An admixture, resolutely catalogued, precisely not what was wished for. The evidence makes no claim, issues no rebuke. It simply stands as it is. Spread across the archive table, numbers and names scribbled on worn labels. Spatial plotting traces the contours with care. Boundaries are mapped, but they blur edges fading into zones where sown and wild mingle irreversibly. Samples from field margins and inner storerooms speak across this space. Their correspondence measured in the shifting ratios of presence and absence. Nothing is trumpeted. Patterns emerge, but only in patience, only if allowed to gather, as morning mist gathers in the low places, hinting at more than what is seen through a single glance. The expectation of fidelity falters quietly, a background hum now out of tune. All of this resides in catalogues. The envelopes, the packets, paper fading at the seams. No voice but the numbers. No testimony but their arrangement. Somewhere, the memory of orderly fields persists, lines sown straight, harvests pure, the intended species returned from planting to granary unblemished. Yet, in the evidence, something slides. The increase of what was not meant to be there, marked each time by a line in a ledger or a dot on a field map. Containers once sealed now open, offering up their commingled remnants, neither fully echoing the past intent nor revealing the full story of their change. What is missing is noted, as much as what is present. Absence is recorded as surely as encroachment. Rooms where only weeds appear, or jars curiously void of the expected crop, accrue meaning most in what they do not say. Silence settles between envelopes, among the grains too small or too fragmented to claim identity. The laboratory holds these fragments not as answers, but as a procession of uncertainties, accumulating in the intervals between the facts. Each act of cataloguing is a soft admission that time alters compositions, reroutes intentions, bears weeds into places where only crops were expected. There is tension between what was sown and what took root, preserved not in story, but in assemblage. The evidence refuses to explain itself, and the observer is left to draw lines between what can be known and what quietly eludes. In the dust, in the not-quite silence of the storeroom, the shift is held waiting, unresolving, poised in the measured distance between expectation and botanical trace. The fields themselves have gone silent, and the memory of their borders is transmitted now only by the seeds, sorted and sleeved, names pressed like shadows into paper. Which fields welcomed the weeds? There is a confidence that settles, quietly, around the idea of continuity. It is built into the root of the roads, the belief that careful maintenance, reliable surfaces, and visible order signify a living civic presence. There persists a sense that where roads are tended to, some thread of habit and purpose endures. The stones are set, the ruts are filled, and the boundary between neglect and care remains clear. At first glance, the assumption is self-sustaining. Roads continue as long as the city does, where the gutter stones are squared and the surface level, where the compactness of each stratum proves deliberate. There speaks a silent record of ongoing attention. The civic narrative, smooth and unworried, is written into the carriageway. But the records, patient and unwilling to render simple comfort, quietly reveal their own story. The fieldwork, undertaken meticulously, renders the smooth surface into cross-sectional slices, measured with string lines and stakes, their profiles mapped and recorded. A single transect, cut shallow through a grassed-over lane, bears its own testimony. Here, the structure is layered, more varied than expected. Above, in the most recent phase, grass roots intertwine with wind-blown soil. There is a faint echo of what once ran beneath a subtle memory of passage, pressed into compacted silt and botanical detritus. In places the roadbed opens like the cross-section of memory itself. Sequences demarcated, phases of resurfacing and use, marked by deliberate arrangements of stones. In the earlier levels, the pattern is disciplined stones cross-laid and level, edge after edge, interrupted by the occasional dark wash of soil pressed into the spaces between them. These are not random casts of gravel, but ordered strata, the patient work of repeated care. Compactness readings, cold and numerical, register firmness that spoke once to preparation and intention. The rutting is confined, not allowed to deepen. Edges are clear. Surface detritus is minimal, swept away by a regular human rhythm. Yet, in the uppermost layers, the silence shifts. One stands at the transect edge and notes where the measure of order falls away. The structure unravels. Artifact scatters are sparse and contextless. One fragment of ceramic pressed, flush against a softened indentation. A sliver of glass barely distinguishable from the overlying dust. Compactness drops, the resistance weakens. Where ruts should have been resurfaced, they instead have filled themselves slowly, inevitably, by accumulation of silt and blown matter. Not by intention, but by abandonment. Botanical remains persist, remarkably preserved in situ. Seeds, leaf fragments, even the threaded tips of roots undisturbed, layering presence over absence. The record is not loud. It conveys neglect in the gentlest of accumulations, silence thick with implication. Regular resurfacing stops. Stones are missing, or else scattered and drawn down into the softening matrix of silts. The sharp horizon that once distinguished care from erosion grows amorphous, feathered by decay. There is no new layer to reset the threshold. It is not a collapse, not a catastrophe, but a fading, a slow surrender to grasses and shifting dust, passing unnoticed at the pace of seasons. In this upper zone, time widens. The gap between event and memory stretches thin. The measured sketches, the photographs, the compactness logs. Each strand is kept not for the certainty it provides, but for what it unsettles. How does one annotate the boundary between a road kept and a road forgotten? Enumerate the absence of a hand, the lack of a shovel, the silence left by no step, no wheel. The record sits under glass, resting within the logic of sediment, stone, and silence. Each document gestures to what is no longer there, but also to the hollow persistence of expectation itself. The field notebooks are careful not to say too much. They describe, map, render compactness and rut depth in lines and numbers, but refrain from conjecture. The archive is full, not of answers, but of these measured absences. It is the uncertainty that lingers. The evidence draws a delicate tension, a line between the civic promise of continuity and the quiet, almost undetectable signals of neglect. It is in the barely disturbed overgrowth, the irrefutable patchiness, the preserved botanical litter, and the lack of all else, that the records prod the assumption, not declaring it false, but simply unable to uphold it. Field book in hand is to listen for what is missing as much as what persists. The absence folds back over itself, then, now, and again layer over layer. Expectation over evidence, a slow, almost imperceptible unmaking. Which routes were no longer kept passable? You began with a question in a room of dust and quiet. The same images return. Clay, stone, layers folded into cabinets and maps. The evidence shifts now toward what is inherited, the brittle registers, the unsealed jars, the unused seals, and toward our duty as their caretakers. You are offered fragments to guard, not to resolve. Sit with the uneven archive. Consider what you will keep and what you will allow to fade. If you find value here, keep this quiet ritual going. Like, subscribe, return to the shelves. What will you preserve?